There's a very famous story about a giant hydroelectric project in Guatemala. In order to build this project, to clear this lands, thousands of indigenous people were displaced from their lands, hundreds died in massacres, and the government waged this campaign of brutal torture and intimidation just to finish the project. Now, why am I talking about this project, the Chixoy Dam project, when today we're here to talk about foreign interference in domestic economies, especially developing countries? Well, it's because the Chixoy Dam project was built with a lot of money, a loan from the World Bank. That World Bank loan ended up spiraling into a ton of debt that Guatemala still lives under today, but more importantly, the World Bank never actually acknowledged any of the murders or any of the displacements, any of the things that went on in order to build the Chixoy Dam in the first place. Instead, it was actually so pleased with the project that it actually ended up lending more money to the project later on. Welcome back to Champagne Anarchism. Hello and welcome back to the Champagne Anarchism series on Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America, this unbelievable book. I know I say this every time, but it's such a pleasure to be able to come here and read this book and talk about all of these chapters. If you want more of this, if you want to go through this book chapter by chapter, and this is one of those, I would say, must-read books. If you are interested about decolonial theory or colonization or the history of Latin America, this is one of those books that you must read. And if you want a reading series that takes you through this, you can check out this one. This is on the Champagne Anarchism Patreon, That's patreon.com/Champagne Anarchism. All of these episodes are also up on YouTube, and every now and again I'll do an extra kind of social media video around this. You can find that on TikTok, you can find that on Instagram, and I am now on Blue Sky. I'm going to start taking that a little more seriously. So please check out any of those channels, like, subscribe, comment, all of that good stuff. Now, the chapter we are covering today is chapter 5. That's actually the final chapter of the original version of this book. Galeano does come back later on and he writes a chapter 6 or section 3, depending on how you look at it, that comes 7 years after this book is written. And of course, we will be covering that on this channel, but for now, this is basically the end of the original book. So if you've made it this far, if you're actually reading along with this series, congratulations. I mean, this is an incredible achievement. And I think I'm justified in saying this, but if you've read all the way up to this point, you have probably come across things that you didn't necessarily know or you hadn't necessarily thought about, or maybe you hadn't framed it in this particular way. And it is just a tremendous book. And if you have had those moments of kind of epiphany or realizations that have struck you at any point during this process, I absolutely want to hear about them. Please, again, comment anywhere you feel comfortable. Reach out to me directly as well. Some of you have done that, and that is really amazing to hear from some of you. So I really appreciate all of this, and what an accomplishment if you've made it this far to chapter 5 in this book. Chapter 5 is all about protectionism, and we will be talking all about protectionism. And just like the previous videos, we'll be breaking this down into a couple segments. Now, protectionism broadly is the idea that if you want to develop a local industry, what you have to do is you have to protect it from outside competition. So you can do anything from throwing up tariffs to subsidies to import requirements and restrictions around that to directly like investing in a particular company in your country. This happens all the time, and it is a way that countries have used over time to develop local industries and have them then compete on global markets with some of the major players. So protectionism is basically the reverse of the free trade argument that you may have heard before. Free trade is supposed to bring benefits to every country that takes part in it. You specialize in what you're good at and you bring that to the global market, and this free competition among nations allows the world to advance and every nation within that to advance. It's a win-win situation. It's never actually worked like that. There is no such thing as free trade. That's one of the things that you will learn reading Galeano. But protectionism is kind of the opposite of that argument. Protectionism is people pointing at the countries that have succeeded, countries like Japan, South Korea, China, the United States, most of Western Europe, all of these countries that have very specifically targeted industries that they're good at, and protected them. So whether it's Japan trying to develop a car industry by propping up Toyota, that is a company that the government has invested heavily in the past, or China requiring technology transfers from companies that want to come in and invest and open up their own local factories. China has often required a degree of technology transfer to the local producers as well. That's another form of protectionism. Or of course the United States, which writes the rules of global trade to protect its specific industries, especially things like entertainment or pharma, which have to do with intellectual property. And so there's a lot of protections built into the international trading infrastructure that specifically protect the United States. Now, I say that this chapter is about protectionism. Really, it's about how to break protectionism, how foreign powers can come in and break open a market that was previously protected. And so with that in mind, we are breaking this chapter down into 4 different pieces. In the first section, we are going to talk about the civilizing mission. We're going to go all the way back to the first chapter, and if you want a refresher on that, you can watch the video that I did on the first chapter, when we talk about the civilizing mission and the technocrats that come in and break open markets themselves. In the second section, we're going to focus on the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. They are 2 very different multilateral institutions that functionally do a very similar thing when it comes to breaking open developing countries as markets. In the third section, we're going to talk about foreign aid, especially this agency called USAID or USAID sometimes. We'll come to that and we'll talk through that. And finally, in the fourth section, we will be breaking down global trade, and we'll be looking specifically at things like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, that's the GATT, or the World Trade Organization, which comes after the GATT. This book was written when the World Trade Organization did not yet exist. This was still, and you will see this in the book as you read Galeano, you will see him refer to the GATT, but more modern day, we can think of the WTO. Functionally, they do very similar things. It's just that the WTO kind of steps up its game when it comes to free trade. So we'll talk a little bit about the rules of global trade and how developed nations protect their interests. And I apologize today, it's a bit of an alphabet soup between the IMF and the GATT and the WTO, all of this stuff. I will try to boil it down to the kind of simple stuff, but there's plenty of reading to be done around this, and there's a lot of incredible work that a lot of people and really dedicated researchers have done over the years in their criticisms of the IMF. This is not just Galeano, this is a long tradition that comes right up to the present day. We still talk about pretty much everything that Galeano was talking about in this chapter. So let's get right into it. And let's start, of course, with this idea of the civilizing mission. Now, when it comes to the civilizing mission, there is a section title that Galeano uses in this chapter when he's talking about foreign aid in this section, but he says that technocrats are better hold-up artists than Marines. And I actually think about this idea quite a bit. You know, we mentioned at the very start of this series that when the great empires of Europe came into the New World to start colonizing what would later become Latin America, they had in mind gold and silver, obviously, but also a civilizing mission. They saw the people that they were conquering as backward savages. These were savage shores that they were coming to as agents of Christendom. They were there to spread their religion. They were there to spread their values, their beliefs, their God's empire across the world. All of this is also true. You know, this is a rapacious quest for gold and silver, but backing it is this idea that Christendom should dominate the world. And remember, this is the Spain of the Reconquest. This is a Spanish empire that is incredibly aware of the fact that there are outside forces that will challenge its God and therefore its control over its people. And so Spain is very willing to go out there and spread the good word. And back then, they believed that there was something deeply barbaric about the local populations. They thought that they were bringing light to the darkness. Now, obviously, this is absurd. I mean, this is completely ridiculous, but this was genuinely how a lot of people in Spain were thinking about this at the time. And way back when I was recording that first video for this series, I said that Galeano will come back to this idea of the civilizing mission. He's trying to draw a straight line between the empires of the past and the empires of the present. And this chapter is where he does that. And so you see in this chapter that the civilizing mission of the Spanish and the Portuguese, and of course the Dutch and the British, which come later, they also have their own civilizing missions. In fact, it's a huge deal for the British in particular, but they also have their civilizing missions, and the civilizing missions of those empires back then are exactly the same, just in a different form as the civilizing mission of the US empire now. And of course, I'm picking a lot on the US because I'm from the US and because it is the global hegemon, but this is something that happens all the time. You can see a civilizing mission in the way that a lot of empires that still kind of exist in some form or another still operate. When France talks about its former colonies, especially in West Africa, it uses a lot of this language. It's just that now, instead of sending missionaries, we send technocrats. Now, if you have just come to this channel, I should do a quick plug actually for a book that we did last year. That's of course Arundhati Roy's Capitalism, A Ghost Story. And Arundhati Roy actually, by the way, blurbs this book. You can see her right on the back here, saying how excellent and important Galeano's work is. But Arundhati Roy, the incredible novelist and reporter, she has this whole idea about the missionaries of the past that would go in and break open markets being replaced by technocrats and aid workers and experts that are coming in similarly with a very similar civilizing mission. And that's important because they are not necessarily sending soldiers. Of course, in many cases, especially in Galeano's time, the US was literally sending soldiers or mercenaries to go do the work of US empire. Now they don't actually need to, and Galeano is kind of on the cusp of this turning into a norms-based way of invading somewhere. You are sending well-meaning people who truly believe in the civilizing mission. These are the old-school missionaries who are coming to enslave the native population, but are doing it under the auspices of good work. They think that they are genuinely bringing light to a dark place. Now, of course, the civilizing mission is a pretense, but it's a tremendously effective one. You know, the civilizing mission works because empires need to hide their evil. Nobody wants to be the villain in their own story, and they need to sell, you know, not just to themselves, to the elites that are doing this, because elites also buy into this idea to a very large extent, you might be surprised, but they need to sell this to the population as well. They need to say, listen, we're doing this not because we're an evil empire, but because we are bringing light to darkness. We are trying to do good in the world, and that is why we must do this. And that's why you see a lot of empires doing what they do. Britain, I'm sitting in London right now as I record this, but the British Empire very famously carried out a program where they burned a lot of their colonial records. It's a program called Operation Legacy where they did this, and it's one of the reasons that we actually don't know a lot of the things, the truly evil and heinous things that the British Empire did, because they literally burned all the records because it could have hurt the sentiment back home. You know, it's hard to sell people on the idea that we are going in to take advantage of impoverished workers who need to work in near servitude, indentured servitude conditions in factories that we have set up because we are here to extract stuff. It's tough to sell people on that idea, but it's much easier to sell people on a $100 million investment in a local factory in Bangladesh on behalf of Nike. That's something that supports the local economy and supports local workers. Of course, they're the same thing. This is the civilizing mission, just in a modern capitalistic and economic form. So as we go through these next three sections, when we get into the alphabet soup a little bit, remember that this is always bubbling away in the background. There's always this veneer of a civilizing mission. This is always something that we are coming to do good. You know, the IMF is coming in to save an economy, not to break it open to foreign competition and to flood it with American goods, but because we really care about the people of the country that we're coming into to try to save. And with that in mind, let's move on to the World Bank and the IMF. And let's start by talking about the IMF. Now, there are a lot of criticisms of the IMF, and if you know anything about the kind of history of the anti-globalization struggle, the battle for Seattle and all of this stuff, the massive protests that erupted around the IMF and its conditionality, we'll get into this idea in a sec, but its conditionality, you know that there are a lot of leftists out there that are incredibly critical of the IMF, and it's for a very good reason. And most of those modern criticisms, by the way, of the IMF, Galeano makes them right here. Now, forgive me if you already know this, but the IMF is essentially the lender of last resort for developing economies that come into trouble, especially debt trouble. So an economy can't pay its debt, and the IMF steps in to lend them money. It's not the original form of the IMF. It's not what the institution was set up to do in the first place, back in what's called the Bretton Woods Conference back in 1947. However, this is the modern incarnation of the IMF. This is what the IMF does now. It's the lender of last resort. Country gets into trouble, IMF comes in to rescue it with a loan. But the loans come with some strings attached, and those strings are devastating. When the IMF lends, it comes with specific conditions, things that a country has to do. So to unlock a tranche of money so that you can use it to pay down your debt, you have to do certain things in your economy. And those certain things are the typical neoliberal program. You probably heard some of these before. Things like strict, austere budgets, which means cutting down the government budget. It includes a lot of deregulation, deregulating kind of key sectors of the economy. Typically, it means free floating your currency, unless you're a former French colony, but that's a whole separate thing. And then there's slashing public spending on vital services, slashing subsidies to particular parts of the market. A lot of countries subsidize oil, for example, so that people can use it, drive around, stimulates the local economy. A lot of that is cutting back subsidies for those sorts of things. This is a lot of the general neoliberal program, what we typically refer to as the Washington Consensus. This is stuff that we've seen before, and really it's about breaking open markets so that, first, the country will be debt dependent forever. And second, so that foreign companies can come in and buy a bunch of assets very cheaply. A lot of the time, this is the IMF saying, you have to privatize this national company. This kind of happens a lot. And then who buys up the assets of that formerly national company? Private investors, normally in the major countries that are giving money to the IMF, although no country actually gives money to the IMF. That's another very sort of technical thing. Either way, Galeano's view here is that the IMF is not just an economic institution, it is a tool of empire. Galeano is quite clear here. This is an economic institution that underpins the global economic order. Everything functions because the IMF is there to backstop investments in developing economies. Absolutely. However, really what the IMF is a tool of corporate interests back in the United States. And by the way, I could fill the next hour of this video with thoughts about the IMF and the way that it provides a backstop for losses for financial companies back in the United States, the way that it breaks open nationalized industries for private investors to come in and buy it up. But we simply do not have the time. Maybe someday I will do a specific video targeted against the IMF. This is one of the most evil multilateral agencies that we have. Multilateral agency, by the way, is just an agency of the world, let's say, that has a bunch of different countries that give it money and has representation from all those different countries. Although the most represented country, of course, in the IMF is the United States. Last time I checked, I think they had about 16% voting share, but I'll double check that. Now, on the World Bank side, the World Bank is actually very much the same. It's the mechanisms that they use to get the conditions are slightly different. The IMF requires a letter of intent from a country that they will do certain things in order to unlock certain tranches of the financing. The World Bank, however, operates through something called DPF, that's Development Policy Financing, and that will impose certain conditions to unlock money that is directed to specific programs within the country. So the country typically needs to have policies in place already to get this loan, that sort of thing. They're doing functionally the same thing, but they're through different kind of avenues. Now, the one thing that the World Bank does do quite differently from the IMF is that they will typically do project-based financing. So they will pick a specific project. Guatemala's dam project, the Chixoy Dam, is a perfect example of this. And they will lend money to that country to complete the project. And the thing is, these projects typically have a lot of issues. So the World Bank has, throughout its entire history, been plagued by allegations of cronyism, nepotism, of favoritism, of diverting money to powerful elites within the country and just enriching certain individuals at the expense of the rest of the population. They have lost a couple billion in their climate funds with zero explanation. They are addicted to funding fossil fuel projects, even though they say they want a green future for the developing world. All of this stuff. And those are kind of the low-level criticisms of the World Bank. We're not even talking about the criticisms of the World Bank that are allegations of forced removal of indigenous people or just clear-cutting entire swaths of a forest to put down a project. Stuff like this happens all the time with the World Bank. But Galeano isn't specifically complaining about this. Galeano is more interested in the ways that the World Bank and the IMF function to impose neoliberalism on the countries that it is supposed to help. So he says, as soon as Chile accepted the first IMF mission in 1954, the country swarmed with its advisors, and today most of the governments blindly follow its directives. The therapy makes the sick man sicker. The better to dose him with the drug of loans and investments. Galeano is saying here that the IMF is a tool of the United States. And also that the IMF will guide the actions of basically every other actor in the economic system at the behest of the United States. And he is right about that. Banks and investors, they lend to countries or withhold funding from countries based on what the IMF says and based on whether the IMF will back up their investment. And then, of course, people very rightly complain about the absolute lack of representation for the developing countries at the level of the IMF and the World Bank. In fact, there's this long-standing gentleman's agreement that exists with the World Bank and the IMF. The IMF head is always a European and the World Bank head is always an American. That's just always been the case, and every time the election comes up, somebody will make noise about how this shouldn't be the case. It shouldn't be just another American in charge of the World Bank, but it just always is. And there's one more quote from Galeano here. He says, the IMF was created to institutionalize Wall Street's financial dominion over the whole planet. And it's just pretty much impossible to say that better. So let's move on to the next section. Let's talk about aid, especially USAID or USAID. Some people call it USAID. I've always just heard USAID. I'm just going to go with USAID. Of course, that is the United States Agency for International Development. Now, USAID is the arm for the United States' foreign aid program, and it's been in the news a lot recently because of the Trump administration. I'm recording this video in March of 2025, and at the moment, there is a significant policy from the Trump administration of defunding USAID and firing a ton of employees. Now, this move by Donald Trump fills me with a lot of very conflicted emotions here because although it's been done for the wrong reasons, USAID has always kind of acted as a tool for American imperialism. So while I'm not sorry to see it go, the way in which it's going is pretty terrible. But Galeano, again, he knows better than anyone how much of a tool of U.S. imperialism and hegemony USAID actually is. He kind of runs down the list here of the major criticisms of USAID, which, by the way, are now being swept under the rug now that all of a sudden everybody cares about USAID because the Trump administration is getting rid of it. Anyway, back to the main point. So he runs through some of the major criticisms, everything from the fact that USAID contracts used to mandate the use of U.S. goods, U.S. merchandise, U.S. freighting, all of this in their supposed gifts to developing countries, and also included provisions for bans of trade with the recipient countries and places like Cuba and North Vietnam, the enemies of the United States. So it could be used as a tool of kind of soft power nudging countries away from North Korea and Cuba and towards the United States. And then there's something that's still very true, which is that USAID requires conditions, just like the World Bank, just like the IMF. It has conditions attached to disperse aid. And so Galeano talks about the example of Uruguay, which agreed to limit rice exports so that they could receive flour and corn and sorghum from U.S. agriculture. This U.S. agricultural surplus law, which saw a bunch of surplus and just dumped it on developing markets. Galeano also says that USAID uses its aid as kind of a carrot to influence votes in certain directions, and he talks about the Haitian delegation when they ended up voting Cuba out of the Organization of American States, that's the OAS, in return for a new airport from USAID. That was a way that USAID had to exert influence over Haiti and eject Cuba from this governing body. But perhaps the most significant thing that Galeano talks about when it comes to foreign aid in general is the way that it papers over the cracks of the system here. He says that AID works like the philanthropist who puts a wooden leg on his piglet because he was eating it bit by bit. You know, foreign aid for Galeano is just a smokescreen. And before we turn to trade, let me just say one more thing about the modern incarnation of USAID. You know, it's not that USAID exclusively does bad things. It has very worthwhile projects in places around the world that are incredibly important and do genuinely do good work. Nobody can argue that point. Yes, of course. It is just that, mostly, USAID still operates as a tool for US hegemony. However, saying that, the Trump administration getting rid of USAID will do absolutely nothing. In fact, as I'm recording this video, it looks like a lot of that USAID budget will get rolled into the DFC. That's the Development Finance Corporation. That's kind of the private sector financing wing of the American aid push. That's what the US wants to do when it is trying to support private industry in a particular region and raise private dollars to do things that aid would otherwise do. The DFC is terrible, on the level almost of the World Bank, but either way, this is where that USAID money is supposed to be going. And of course, this does the exact same thing, just more obvious. But let's move on to global trade now, and especially the GATT, that's the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Now, the GATT is kind of the global rules of the road for international trade. When Open Veins of Latin America was written, that's now been supplanted by the WTO, which is far more extensive. Now, we've already talked about some of this when we addressed the previous chapters. Of course, trade is a significant theme that runs through the entirety of Open Veins of Latin America. I mentioned the work of Ha-Joon Chang, the Korean economist who has looked really intensively at a lot of this stuff, and his book, Bad Samaritans and Kicking Away the Ladder, his other book, absolutely brilliant on this idea of trade and protectionism. So if you want more detail, go to Ha-Joon Chang and check out his work. It is tremendous. But let's talk trade for a second, because the rules of global trade always are skewed in the favor of developed countries. The rich countries dictate the rules, and there's a very good reason for that. The reason, of course, is because they have just significantly more negotiating power, right? If you look at the US and Ghana, Ghana needs the US market. The way things are set up, the way the game is run, Ghana needs the US market. If they want to continue attracting capital, if they want to continue exporting, if they want precious dollars to defend their currency in terms of foreign currency reserves, they need the United States to continue to accept Ghanaian products. The United States does not need Ghana, and so any trade deal that's done between those two, or a multilateral trade deal, which includes a bunch of countries, or under the rules of the WTO, which is kind of a negotiating web of different alliances and trade deals, all of this is done with the US holding pretty much all the cards. And that means that the institutions that we've built up to manage trade are dominated by entities like the United States. Now, of course, there are countries out there who can challenge the United States, notably China. India is another one of those. Mexico has some negotiating power, absolutely, within Latin America. It is an incredibly important market for US products. That's pretty undeniable. The European Union in general, as a unit, has a lot of negotiating power, but the separate states within the EU don't really. And that's why the EU tends to negotiate as a unit. But of course, there's a whole other realm of rules of trade within the EU itself. But our international trading infrastructure overall is very geared towards the interests of the United States and most of the powerful, already developed nations. And that leaves developing countries in a really difficult position of typically exporting very low value goods. So that's everything from raw materials to low value added electronics and pieces and parts integrated into these global value chains. But a lot of the time, this is just stuff being ripped out of the ground, sent off to the global north to be refined, manufactured, all of this stuff, and then sent right back in at at tremendous cost. Now, some economists see this as a natural progression. You start with low-value goods, and then you work your way up the value chain until eventually you're exporting high-value goods. That's absolute nonsense. The only times when that has actually managed to happen are with countries that have used protectionism, a high degree of protectionism. That's how Japan developed its car industry. But you can't develop a car industry if you are subject to a web of trade deals that make it impossible to do the kinds of interventions that you need to do to develop a car industry. And meanwhile, when you look at the developed world, the other side of this equation, there are really very rarely equivalent rules in place. So the US heavily, for example, the US heavily subsidizes cotton within the United States and then dumps that subsidized cotton on international markets. There are countries that try to compete with US cotton. There are sub-Saharan African countries that rely on cotton and have complained, and every time they complain, nothing happens. Within the rules of the World Trade Organization, absolutely nothing happens. This is just the United States using its economic power around the world to negotiate the deals that will protect it. And Galeano, of course, is very keenly aware of this dynamic. What would happen, he asks, to the prosperity of Midwest cattlemen if the United States permitted access to its internal market without tariffs and fanciful sanitary prohibitions of better and cheaper meat from Argentina and Uruguay? In other words, what would the United States look like if it didn't have all of this trading regime to back up its local industries? It's probably a question that we'll never learn the answer to. But hey. Now, before we end, I want to circle back to that story that I told at the beginning about Guatemala and the Chixoy Dam project, especially after everything that we've just talked about when it comes to debt in particular. Because the thing is, the loan for that Chixoy Dam, this happens in 1982. The thing about that loan is in the mid-1970s, Guatemala only had a total external debt of about $120 million. But then after a decade of this type of lending from places like the World Bank, it increased by $2 billion. And that's not a debt overhang that you can actually get out from under. I mean, that is an impossible debt burden. And now, because that's the thing about debts, is that they just keep accruing and interests pile up and debt just expands. It completely balloons. Now, Guatemalan debt stands at more than $12 billion. And every year, Guatemala has to spend $500 million, roughly, alone, just to service that debt. This is just how all of this works. And to escape it, well, nobody's escaped it just yet. But Galeano does end with a note, not a note of hope, but a note, let's say, of challenge. And it is, of course, the final paragraph of the original version of Open Veins of Latin America, and it's an absolute banger. He says, "The task lies in the hands of the dispossessed, the humiliated, the accursed. The Latin American cause is above all a social cause. The rebirth of Latin America must start with the overthrow of its masters, country by country. We are entering times of rebellion and change. There are those who believe that destiny rests on the knees of the gods, but the truth is that it confronts the conscience of man with a burning challenge." And with that, let's go ahead and close this chapter. Thank you, as always, for watching and listening. Let me know what you think. As always, we will be back next week to talk about the final chapter of this book, the thing that Galeano returned 7 years after with and included in this book's publication later on. And of course, this chapter was written well into the period of Operation Condor and after the fall of his native Uruguay into dictatorship. All of this happens, and we will talk about all of that next week, so stay tuned for that. As always, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. Check out the Patreon channel. Again, that's patreon.com/champagneanarchism. I really can't thank enough everybody who comes to watch and comment and talk about all this stuff. It is really, really fantastic. So cool to see. And yeah, we'll be back next week to close out Open Veins of Latin America. I will see you then. Thank you.